I have a Minolta MC W.Rokkor-X 28mm f2.8 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. This is the MCX style of the 28mm Rokkor-X lenses, and I have the regular just MC Rokkor here, not the Rokkor-X. And you can see that this one over here that I'm going to be disassembling, the Rokkor-X, is a good bit smaller when you're looking at it from the side. And it's also quite a bit lighter than this regular MC lens. Internally, it's a lot easier to disassemble this lens as well. The regular Rokkor lens here is fairly hard to take apart, and the Rokkor-X version of this lens is actually very simple in its construction, and it's actually the simplest of the 28mm lenses that I've taken a look at. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens to get access to the diaphragm, the optics, and the individual body sections and the mechanical parts so that those can all be repaired and maintenanced on their own. I'll start by going in from the back of the lens here and getting access to the back of the diaphragm blades. So looking at the back, you can see it has a small back glass piece right here with two little divots for a spanning wrench right there. So I'll use the spanning wrench on this back glass piece. And much like on the regular Rokkor lens, the back glass piece of this is much smaller than the front glass piece. And it also does have a second set of little divots in here on it that can be used to undo the first of the back glass elements on here using this little set of inner divots. You just have to be careful when undoing that not to scratch the glass. So I'll set this aside. Now I have access to the back of the diaphragm blades right here. And to get access to the front of the diaphragm blades, I'm going to flip the lens over and we have to go in from the front. On the front, around this name ring in here, there are two little divots as well for a spanning wrench, but because these are actually recessed down inside the name ring and there's not really a good way to get a slotted or a flat tip spanning wrench into here, they're just too small, I found that you have to use a pointed tip spanning wrench. So let me grab that. So one with the pointed tips instead, and you can go in and with these two divots undo the name ring. Unlike on the regular Rokkor lens, this Rokkor-X one does use a plastic name ring, and I believe the regular Rokkor lens uses a metal name ring. But overall, the construction uses the higher quality MC parts, except for a few components like this plastic name ring here. Now I have access to the front optical piece in here, going around here. And you can actually try to undo it at this stage, but because it's pretty far down inside the lens, it's easier to take off this black ring going around here, which is what the filters screw into and what extends in and out as I focus here. It's easier to take that off first and then remove the front optical piece. So to undo this black ring, there are 8 screws total going around here. And you want to find the 4 screws that are on top of the black ring. The other 4 are they have cutouts and then they're going down into the next level, but there are 4 going around here that are actually sitting on top. So I'll undo those 4 and then remove this black ring. Now you can see as I focus out here, I have the front optical piece extended out past the front of the lens now, and much better access to actually undo this front optical piece to have a better grip onto it. So what I want to do now is just grab this front optical piece on the black rings going around here and unscrew it to get access. This will remove the front optical piece and also get me access to the front of the diaphragm blades. Alright. So the front optical piece here, it's quite a bit smaller than on the regular Rokkor lens, if I remember correctly. And on the regular Rokkor lens, there's this other like protective glass piece in front. that's separate from the main front optical piece. And on this one, it's just a single optical piece, and there's no, it doesn't have that protective piece as well. So set that aside. Now we have access to the front of the diaphragm blades in here. So it can be cleaned. And one nice thing about this lens is that with just a few more steps, if there's any oil or stuff on the diaphragm blades, you can try to clean it now. But it's really easy to just remove the entire diaphragm mechanism, and it can be cleaned pretty well on its own. The diaphragm is in one big self-contained piece, so you can clean it pretty well on its own. And so looking down at the lens in its current state, we have the diaphragm mechanism down in here, and then the focusing ring going around here. And to undo the diaphragm mechanism and just lift that out of the lens, I'm going to undo the 4 screws going around on here on this kind of brass colored washer, that's what's actually holding in the entire diaphragm mechanism. So undo these 4. Now I can just remove this washer type thing sitting on top of it. And that leaves the diaphragm piece in here being able to be freely rotated, and you can just lift it out as well. The setup of this diaphragm piece, it's very much in the style of a lot of the earlier MC lenses and earlier Rokkor lenses, where it's a separate piece and it's not integrated into the diaphragm mechanism like most of the MD pieces have. Or it's not integrated into the focusing mechanism like most of the MD lenses do. So this piece can be pretty well cleaned on its own. There aren't too many complex mechanical parts besides just the diaphragm down here, and there's nothing else you really have to worry about during cleaning this. To clean it off, you can just use Q-tip and a little bit of cleaning solution to go in here and just carefully brush against the diaphragm blades on both sides, and even submerge this entire thing in cleaning solution and then carefully dry it off and clean off the individual blades. But if there's quite a bit of oil on here, you can also fairly easily take this blade mechanism out and clean the individual blades. And if you look here at the front of the diaphragm, there's this black plate holding all the blades in place. You can actually see the blades moving back and forth in here in these little slots as I move the aperture control lever back here. And that black plate is just held in place by the 3 I believe 3 screws going around on the edge here. So these little slotted screws. And once you undo those 3 little slotted screws, then you can lift up this black plate and the blades will all fall out. There's a separate back plate here that the blades also lock into, and you can also remove that and then clean the blades on their own. Then you can reassemble the entire diaphragm mechanism outside of the lens and just slide it back in so that the aperture control lever goes back in through here. It's almost identical in how it's set up to the 50mm normal length lenses in just the reassembly process. So I'm not going to show it on this lens. It's a slight bit harder because the blades are smaller, but they're not as small as they are on the regular Minolta lens, the non-Rokkor-X version. This one's actually a slight bit more repairable in that respect. One other thing that I forgot to mention on the front optical piece here, you can actually undo this further. So if there's fungus or anything inside the lens, like dust that you want to try to clean out, that's actually inside the optical pieces in here, the optical elements, it's not just on the front surface or the back surface here. You can undo these pieces by unscrewing the different layers in here. You can see that they have little indentations and there's these different layers. Most of these do have a little bit of adhesive or something that's keeping them locked together, and they can be a little bit hard to undo. It's hard to grip this thing well, but if you just use a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, a very slight amount so that you're not flooding the inside of the lens, and drizzle it around the sections in here, the individual layers, wait a little while, and then get a good grip on it, you can undo the individual elements and get access to inside of the optics to clean that out. I really wouldn't recommend doing that unless you really need to and there's like a lot of fungus inside the lens or something, because you're almost certainly going to make the lens look worse when you put it back together. It's very hard to avoid getting additional dust or fingerprints or stuff back into the lens when you're putting it back together. So it's usually best to just leave this piece as is for all but the most serious problems. Continuing on with the main lens body here. Now I'm going to start removing some of these body sections so that they can be cleaned on their own. The body assembly in here and the mechanical parts that are coupling the body sections to the diaphragm and the optics, it's all a very simple design. It's much like the 50mm MC lenses, and that a lot of the parts are separate, but the design itself is very simple. It's a lot simpler actually than the 28mm non-Rokkor-X Minolta lens that I've taken apart. And that one had a lot of little individual components and things, whereas this one has a lot of big integrated components that are easy to take apart, and they're made of metal and other higher quality materials, unlike the MD 28mm. So to start with this disassembly of the body, I'm going to remove this silver ring on the back section here, part of the mounting plate. It just is held in place by 3 little slotted screws going around into the edge here. So I'll slightly loosen these up. You don't need to take them out all the way, and it's probably best that you don't, because they're pretty hard to get back into place. And this ring will just lift right up. Now I have access to the aperture control ring running around back here. And if I try to lift off the aperture control ring, you can see that the aperture control ring has this bar going in over here from the outer section of the aperture control ring on the top here into the inner section. So you can't just lift it out directly. And what this metal piece here is, it's actually the aperture control curve. So on the inside of the lens, as you rotate the aperture control ring back and forth, and I'll describe this a little more on the reassembly, this metal curved piece right here is what is controlling the aperture with this little post. And as I mentioned, I'll talk more about that on the reassembly. But for now, we just have to remove this bar so that we can actually remove the aperture control ring and get that out of the lens. So to undo this bar, I'm just going to loosen up these 2 screws. You don't actually need to remove them fully in this case. So loosen those up, and then I'll push with a flat screwdriver. I'll push on this side here, just knock the aperture control curve in a little ways. And then on the inside, you can jiggle the aperture control lever around here all about, and the little aperture control curve should fall right out. So there's the aperture control curve. And now the aperture control ring has nothing holding it in place. The one other thing about this though is the little ball bearing. So when I rotate this back and forth, it has the clicking sound, and that's being produced by a little ball bearing over in this section over here, I believe. So I'm going to be careful when I take this apart not to lose the little ball bearing. And okay, so here's the aperture control ring, and then here's the ball bearing right down here, and then the little pocket that it sits in. The ball bearing is positioned on the aperture control ring on this lens. So now I have the main lens body here again. And next I'm going to separate the focusing mechanism here from the back section, which actually has all the parts that are coupling the stop-down lever and the aperture control ring into the diaphragm. So it's going to separate this top section up here with the focusing control ring that's visible on the outside of the lens from this bottom section down here. And to do that, I'm just going to loosen up the 4 screws going around here, 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 and here. And now I'll just lift off this top section here and separate these 2 pieces. So this back section here with the depth of field scale running around here in the 28mm marking, this is what contains the coupling of the stop-down lever and the aperture control ring into the diaphragm. You can't actually easily remove all the little mechanical parts in here. So if you want to try to clean this, like the depth of field scale or this the rest of this ring that is visible on the outside of the lens, it's probably easiest to just carefully go around with a toothbrush and a very small amount of water or cleaning solution, and just be careful not to really break any of the components on the inside here, and make sure that when you're putting it back together that all these components on the inside are really dry, because water can easily hide in the little parts in here, in the mechanical parts. If there are any mechanical problems with the lens, with the stop-down lever, or the aperture control ring. One other cause could be that the mechanical sections in here have friction or something's been bent in here. So the little spring over here could be broken, or there's too much friction, especially between this kind of grayish colored bar and then the stop down lever curve or stop down lever bar in here. That's usually where there would be friction. So you can just apply a little bit of lubricant here or in here if that is a problem on your lens. But I'll set this one aside. And for the final part of this disassembly, I'm going to remove the focusing ring, this body section here, from the actual focusing mechanism on the inside. And this is something that you only need to do if you want to actually clean this focusing ring. So for the focusing mechanism here, unlike the previous body section, I don't actually recommend that you try to clean this in its current state too well with like soap and water or anything, because it's very easy to get moisture inside the focusing mechanism in here. And once that happens, it's a real pain to make sure it's fully dried out and when you reassemble it. So to just remove this focusing ring completely, I'm going to focus it so that it's all the way at one extreme over here. And then I'm just going to mark where this little section over here in the focusing mechanism, this little indentation, is falling against the focusing ring. And this will just kind of give me a rough guide of where I want to reattach it. You have to zero the lens back to infinity once you take off the focusing mechanism. But this guide will let me know roughly where to start. And then to actually undo the focusing ring, I'm going to remove the 3 screws here, here, and here. Alright, so those 3 screws also have little washers on them. And now I've separated the actual body section here, which can be cleaned very well on its own now, from the part that does the focusing. And on this part, if the focusing is not smooth, or it feels like it's grainy, or the focusing is getting stuck, you can take this piece apart further as well by undoing the inner section of the focusing mechanism and just unscrewing it completely from the outer section. The way you do that is you would just remove the little, as I focus in and out here, you can see that it moves up and down, the inner part moves up and down along this little track in here, with this bar holding the inner part in place so it doesn't just rotate around. So to remove this fully, you can just remove these 3 screws to remove the bar in the track here, and then focus the inner part past where you would normally be able to. And that allows you to remove the inner part and actually see the focusing mechanism in here and remove any debris or add some additional oil and lubricants if the focusing is rough or it feels like there's some grit or something stuck in there. So at this stage, the lens is fully disassembled. I have the optics here and here, back optic and the front optic, which can be further disassembled if there's any fungus inside of them, separate from things like the diaphragm here, which can be cleaned on its own, and you can also take out the little individual blades, and separate from the focusing mechanism here and the other mechanical parts on the back section here that are coupling the focus or the aperture control ring and the stop down lever into the diaphragm. And we also have all the body sections on their own. So things like the aperture control ring and the focusing ring here can be cleaned on their own to remove all the grime that tends to build up in the gripping ring here or in the little numbers down here, and make sure that those look as good as possible. Now to start on the reassembly, I'll just grab the focusing mechanism itself right here. And when I took this apart before, we made little marks on the where this bar track section in here was lining up with the outside of the focusing mechanism. And I'm just going to roughly line these up right now. We'll have to zero the lens back to infinity properly later, but I'll get this started because it makes the rest of the reassembly a little bit easier to have this part at least partially together. And then I'll also just go and reattach the 3 screws with the little washers in the 3 places here, here, and here. At this stage, I don't want to tighten these down too much, but I just want it so that the focusing ring is held in place on the lens. So now with that kind of set in place, I'm going to reattach the back section here with the mounting plate and the depth of field scale onto this part. And to line these up, the two things that need to get lined up, there's this part here on the back section of the focusing mechanism with the 3 screws that kind of juts out from the rest of this metal plate. And then on this piece over here, there's this gap over here, and those two need to line up, and then the 4 screw holes in here going around here, 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 and here that connect the two pieces should also line up. Alright, now we have to get the aperture control ring back on. And the aperture control ring has the 2 parts that are important here. One is the little ball bearing. So this little ball bearing here has to go in the pocket of the aperture control ring right here. And this gets pressed up against, when it's on the lens, it gets pressed up against the little grooves right here to make the clicking sound and lock it at each of the different aperture stops. And then the other thing that has to happen after we do that is you have to get the aperture control curve in place. But you can do each of these independently. So first, I'll grab the little ball bearing, put it in the pocket right there. And now I want to find the side of the aperture control ring that has this lever sticking up, and this side is going to go out. So I'm going to find where the little indentations are here, the little grooves are, and just press the little ball bearing. Oops. Press the little ball bearing into the space right above it so that it goes into that pocket, and then just slide it down. And once it's in the correct position, when you rotate this back and forth, you should hear it clicking, and it should kind of stop at each of the different stops in here. Next up, we have to get this aperture control curve back into its position as well. And this is also a good point to talk about how the aperture control ring and the stop-down lever back here are being coupled to the diaphragm mechanism. So on the diaphragm mechanism right here, I have this aperture control lever that actually directly controls the aperture. And this just can be moved freely back and forth. And this locks on the inside in here. It locks down. The little bar goes down into this pocket right here on this black curved piece down here. So when you hit the stop-down lever, this black curved piece moves that lever directly back and forth. So that's how the stop-down lever works, and then the aperture control ring works by using this aperture control curve. As you rotate the aperture control ring, this curve moves back and forth. It's connected to the aperture control ring, so it's moving back and forth. And it's sticking into the lens over here on the inside. So in there's a section in here. And this little post right here that's on the black curve and attached to this black curve, that is in front of the aperture control ring. So as this aperture control curve, as the aperture control curve moves back and forth, that little post goes up and down, which also opens and closes the aperture. So it's moving like this, up and down, along that aperture control ring. So that's how things are being coupled together. And to get this to work properly, you need to get this aperture control curve slid back in place so that it's locked down onto these 2 screws on the outside here, and then on the inside it's in behind this little post back here. So what we want is that when it's at 2.8, which is the maximum aperture, it should have, the little post should be at this side over here, and then when it's at the minimum aperture, the little post should be over here somewhere. So to get this started, I'm going to set it at the minimum aperture of 16 and just grab this little bar or the aperture control curve and position it behind this aperture control post like this. So it's in this position with the larger section over on this side. And I'm just going to slide it back there and work it around a little bit, and should on the other side see So on this other side, you can see now that the aperture control curve is going partly through there, and I'll just press it in the rest of the way. There we go. So it's now going through and onto these two little screws that I loosened up before. So now I'll tighten these down. What I want to look for is that when I rotate this curve back and forth in here, or as I rotate the aperture control ring back and forth, at the minimum aperture of 16, the post is along the curve on this side over here, and then at the maximum aperture of 2.8, it's being lifted up a little bit on this higher section over here. And now this entire thing is locked in place as well by the aperture control curve. Finally, for the back reassembly, just to lock the entire thing down, I'll reattach this silver ring. And this silver ring just can go in any position, doesn't really matter. And the three little slotted screws going around on the edge can just be tightened down to lock it in place. Alright, and I'll check that the aperture control ring is still rotating correctly. Next up, I have to get the actual diaphragm mechanism back into the lens body. So this is pretty easy. I'm just going to position the diaphragm mechanism so that this aperture control post on it, the one that's controlling the actual diaphragm, goes into the little pocket I described earlier down there. So looking in from the back of the lens, just slide these two together so it goes into the little pocket, like that. I'm just going to put on a cap there to give me a better surface to work with. And now I'm going to reattach this and lock it in place using this kind of silver or brass colored washer and the 4 screws going into any of these 8 little screw holes down here. But on this, let me get this started with 2 screws going into here. So on this piece right here, I've just kind of very gently loosened or tightened down these screws. I'll loosen them up a little bit. And this piece right here, this is how you can actually control how the aperture opens and closes, by how you reattach the diaphragm mechanism into the lens. You can see that if I grab the black section on the inside in here, I can just freely rotate that back and forth to open and close the aperture. So to reattach this properly, what I want to do is, right now it's set to 2.8, so it needs to be fully open. So I'm going to rotate this intersection in here until it's just about fully open. I don't see any of the blades on the edge. And then I'm going to try tightening down one of these screws. And what I want to check is that as I rotate the aperture control ring, 2 things are happening. And one, when it's fully open here, I shouldn't be able to see the sides of I shouldn't be able to see the blades at all in here. And the other thing I should be able to notice is that when I rotate this back and forth, it should stop, or it should move, the blades in here should move, the aperture should open or close at every stop in here. So right now you'll notice that as I rotate this back and forth, at these lower stops like 16 through 11 or 9, it's actually not moving at all, which is not good. So I'm going to just retry by loosening these up a little. And then going to 16 here and spinning this around like that, just a little bit more than I did before. And then see how that looks. So now it looks a lot better. When it's fully open, can't see the blades at all, and there's movement at every stop along the way. So that looks pretty good, and I'll just tighten this down by reattaching the other 2 screws here, leaving empty screws in between all of these. Now it's time to reinstall the optics. So for the back optical piece right here, I'm just going to screw down into place into the back section. Use the spanning wrench to lock that down. And now for the front optical piece, it's also just going to screw into the front section in here. So I'm going to focus this out and just screw this whole front optical piece down into the front section. So at this stage, we have the lens all pretty much optically reassembled. And this is actually where you want to focus the lens or zero it back to infinity. So because in this disassembly we took off the focusing ring here, there's a good chance that when the lens is focused at infinity on the camera, it's not actually optically focused at infinity because the focusing mechanism and the focusing ring got out of sync. So to fix that, what you do is you would take this lens as it is in its current state and just mount it on the camera. You have the optics and the mounting plate all reassembled. And then while it's mounted on the camera, you would find where it's optically focused to infinity. So I'd move around in here, and sometimes you may have to loosen up some of these screws in here to reposition the focusing ring and then lock it back down to actually get it over to the correct optical focusing at infinity. And once you find that spot, you would loosen up these 3 screws again in here, and then spin this ring around so that it's the focusing ring here independently of the focusing mechanism and the optical focusing so that it's showing infinity, and then tighten it back down. So that way that when this over here reads infinity, the lens is also optically focused at infinity. But for simplicity in this reassembly, I'm just going to assume that it's optically focused at infinity right now and continue on by reattaching this black ring with that the filters go into. And this black ring has an inner ring on the inside here with little cutouts. These cutouts go over the 4 screws that were previously installed, and then the other 4 screw holes here line up with the rest of the 8 on that little ring down there. And I'll reattach this with the 4 screws. And finally, to complete the reassembly, just screw this plastic name ring back in place. So get it started by hand. And just finish up by using the pointed tip spanning wrench, the 2 divots here, to lock it down the rest of the way. The 28mm Rokkor-X is probably the easiest rocker or 28mm of the Minolta lenses that I've taken apart. Compared to the regular, just plain Rokkor lens, the SG over here, it's much simpler in its internal design, many fewer pieces, and the pieces are much easier to fit together properly. There's less fiddling about to get everything to line up properly. It's more like the later or the MC 50mm lenses in that way. And compared to the MD 28mm lens, it has a lot less plastic and it doesn't use any of the adhesives or cheaper design techniques that the later MD lenses used. So this lens is overall very repairable. You can get access to the diaphragm in 1 or 2 steps and remove the entire diaphragm to clean on its own in probably 5 or 6 steps, and you can really take apart the optics and the focusing mechanism and make any repairs you need on this lens.